The frost had etched its dead white ferns across the inside of the schoolhouse window, obscuring the world that had already forgotten Leanne. Outside, the silence of the snow was absolute, a heavy blanket smothering the high plains and pressing down on the flimsy roof of the one-room building she had once called her purpose. The last family had pulled out a month ago, their footsteps swallowed by the first storm, leaving behind only the hollow echo of their promises to send for her things. They never did. Now the benches sat empty, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of dust and ice. Her books, once her treasure, were now just potential fuel. She traced a character on the frosted pane, home, but the image was foreign, a ghost from a life lived across an ocean. Her husband's memory was like that too, a warmth she could barely summon against the encroaching chill. She wore the red cheongsam he had loved, its silk now thin and frayed, a defiant splash of color against the monochrome despair. It was a foolish thing to wear in this cold, but it was all she had left of that other person, the one who believed in poetry and the power of knowledge in a land that only valued the strength of a man's back and the speed of his draw. The town, nestled a hard 2 miles away, might as well have been on the moon. They had seen her as a curiosity first, then a burden after her husband's cough had stolen the last of his breath. The widow, the foreigner, the teacher with no students. They left tins of beans on her stoop for a week, then the visits stopped. The tins stopped. The world simply moved on, turning its back as the first flakes of the great winter began to fall. Her food was nearly gone. A handful of rice, half a stale loaf of bread. The woodpile had dwindled to a pathetic mound of splinters. Death was no longer an abstract fear. It had a sound, the relentless moan of the wind through the cracks in the walls, and a feeling, the deep, aching cold that had settled into her bones. She was 25 years old, and she was going to die in this empty room, a final, silent testament to a failed dream. The last of the firewood turned to a soft, glowing bed of embers, its warmth a fading whisper against the gale that hammered the schoolhouse. Leanne huddled closer, her breath pluming in the frigid air, the red silk of her dress offering no defense. She had burned a chair yesterday. Today it was the pages of a geography book, the maps of distant, warm lands curling into black ash. The irony was a cold, bitter stone in her stomach. She thought of the heat of her homeland, the steam rising from a bowl of noodles, the press of a summer crowd. Here, heat was a currency she could no longer afford. The embers pulsed one last time, a dying heartbeat, and then winked out. A profound, terrifying darkness fell, and with it the cold rushed in like a predator. It was no longer just an absence of warmth. It was a physical presence, sinking its teeth into her flesh. Shivering became a luxury her body could no longer sustain. A strange lethargy crept over her, a seductive invitation to simply close her eyes and let the whiteness outside become the whiteness within. She curled on the floor, pulling the thin blanket around her, but it was like wrapping herself in paper. Her mind began to drift, seeing her husband's face not as a memory, but as if he were waiting for her just beyond the storm. He was smiling. There was no more coughing. There was no more pain. It would be so easy to go to him, to just sleep. The wind tore at the roof, a sound of pure violence, and a dusting of snow sifted down from the ceiling, landing on her face like a funeral shroud. This was it, the end of the story. A teacher from a faraway land who had believed she could plant a garden of knowledge in a barren wilderness, only to be buried by the very soil she had tried to cultivate. Her last coherent thought was not one of fear, but of a quiet, profound loneliness. To vanish without a single soul to mark her passing felt like the ultimate erasure. She closed her eyes, and the world began to fade into a peaceful, numbing cold. Roan crested the ridge, his horse blowing clouds of steam in the razor-sharp air. He had been tracking a stray from his herd for 2 days, a foolish endeavor in a storm that had already swallowed the sun. But the animal was valuable, and he was not a man who surrendered to the elements easily. He was pulling his collar tighter when he saw it, or rather, what was no longer there. A thin curl of smoke. For weeks he had seen it rising from the chimney of the old schoolhouse on his rides along the northern fence line. He knew the story, the way the town told it. The Chinese teacher and her scholar husband come to fill the children's heads with useless things. Then the husband died, and the town's fleeting tolerance died with him. He'd heard the whispers in the general store, the casual cruelty of people who mistook their own survival for virtue. He'd seen the smoke as a sign of stubborn life, a flicker of defiance he privately respected. But tonight there was nothing, just the unrelenting gray of the sky and the white fury of the blizzard. Something cold, colder than the wind, settled in his gut. It was not his business. The town had made its decision. But Roan lived by a code carved not by society, but by the harsh, honest logic of the land. You do not let a fire go out if you can help it. He turned his horse, urging it down the treacherous slope. The schoolhouse was a dark shape, almost completely buried. He had to force the door against a deep drift, the wood groaning in protest. The cold inside was stagnant, dead. It was a tomb. And then he saw her. A small, still form on the floor, a shocking slash of red against the gray gloom. He knelt, his gloved hand reaching for her neck, expecting to find only cold, stiff flesh. But beneath his fingers he felt it, a pulse, thready, faint, but there, a flicker. He worked without a second thought, his movements economical and sure. He wrapped her in his own heavy oilskin coat, lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her out into the screaming wind. The world was a maelstrom of white, but he held the fragile, fading life against his chest, a single point of warmth in a universe of ice. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and broth. For a long moment she lay still, convinced she was dreaming. The feeling in her limbs was a dull, distant ache, but it was feeling nonetheless. Sensation. Life. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was made of thick, dark beams, solid and sure. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. She was in a bed, buried under a mountain of heavy wool blankets and what felt like a cured animal hide. A man sat in a chair by the fire, his back to her, mending a piece of tack. He was large, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet economy that suggested a deep familiarity with his own strength. This was her rescuer. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in her throat, but she was too weak to give it voice. He had saved her, but why? What would he want in return? She had heard stories, grim tales of what happened to women alone in this country. He must have heard her stir because he turned his head slowly. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, his eyes a pale, clear gray that seemed to miss nothing. He looked at her not with hunger or pity, but with a simple, assessing calm. He rose, walked to the hearth, and ladled some of the steaming broth from a pot into a bowl. He brought it to her, not speaking, and held it out. Leanne pushed herself up, her muscles protesting. She took the bowl, her hands trembling so much the liquid sloshed over the sides. He said nothing, simply stood there, waiting. The broth was hot, salty, and rich with meat. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was life flowing back into her, chasing the last of the icy shadows from her veins. When she was done, he took the empty bowl and returned to his chair. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside, a sound that no longer held any terror. He had brought her into the fortress of his solitude and asked for nothing. In a world that had only taken from her, this simple, unspoken decency was a language she was only just beginning to remember how to understand. As days bled into a week, a quiet rhythm established itself within the small, sturdy cabin. Rowan was a man of few words, his communication offered through action. He kept the fire roaring, the stew pot full, and never once intruded upon her space. He slept on a pallet of furs near the hearth, leaving her the sole occupant of the bed. Leon's strength returned slowly, a fragile seedling pushing its way through frozen ground. She began to take small tasks upon herself, folding the blankets, stirring the stew, sweeping the hearth. They were small gestures of gratitude, a way of reasserting her own existence. One evening she noticed him struggling with a ledger by the firelight, his brow furrowed in concentration, his large fingers looking clumsy as they held the pencil. His writing was a barely legible scrawl. She watched him for a long time before speaking, her voice still soft from disuse. "I can help with that if you like." He looked up, his gray eyes unreadable. He seemed to consider it, then gave a single curt nod and pushed the ledger across the small table toward her. Her hand, when she picked up the pencil, was steady. Her characters were elegant, precise, a stark contrast to his. She began to read the entries aloud, organizing the numbers for supplies and cattle sales into neat columns. He listened, occasionally correcting a name or a figure. A partnership was being forged in the flickering light, one built on numbers and necessity. In return, he began to teach her things, not with words, but by demonstration. He showed her how to properly bank the fire at night so the embers would last till morning. He brought in a pair of his worn leather gloves, the stitching split at the seam, and handed her a thick needle and an awl. He guided her hands, showing her how to punch the holes and draw the sinew thread tight, a double stitch that would hold against the hardest work. His touch was brief, impersonal, yet a current of warmth passed between them that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the simple, profound connection of two people sharing knowledge, a quiet trade of skills that slowly, carefully, began to mend more than just leather. The great thaw came not as a gentle melt, but as a series of surrenders. The iron grip of the frost loosened, and the world began to weep. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a steady, rhythmic drumming that sounded like the world's own returning pulse. The snow receded from the windows, revealing a landscape reborn in shades of brown and tentative green. With the change in season came a change in Roan. He spent more time outdoors, mending fences and tending to his herd, but the quiet space he left behind in the cabin now felt like an absence. Leanne found herself watching the door, waiting for the sight of his broad shoulders filling the frame. One afternoon, as she was airing out the blankets in the pale spring sun, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was not Roan. This man rode with the stiff-backed authority of the law. He dismounted, his spurs jingling, and introduced himself as Sheriff Miller. His eyes swept over the cabin, lingering on the blankets she held, and then fixed on her. "We, heard things in town," he started, clearing his throat. "Figured Roan for a man who kept to himself. Didn't figure him for company." His gaze was a mixture of suspicion and a crude, unwelcome curiosity. Just then, Roan emerged from the barn, his expression hardening as he saw the sheriff. "Miller," he said, his voice flat, "what business brings you all the way out here?" The sheriff gestured vaguely towards Leanne. "Just checking on a civic matter, Roan. There were concerns about the teacher. We all thought she'd moved on." The lie hung in the air, as thin and foul as winter smoke. They had not thought she had moved on. They had assumed she had perished, a problem conveniently solved by the weather. And now, here she was, alive, a complication Roan had brought upon himself. The fragile peace of their shared solitude was shattered. The world, with all its judgments and its prejudices, had found them, and its gaze was cold and unforgiving. The sheriff's visit was like a stone tossed into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward with inevitable speed. When Roan next rode into town for supplies, the silence that fell over the general store was heavy and immediate. Men who had once nodded to him now stared at the floor. Women pulled their skirts aside as if he were carrying a disease. The storekeeper, a man named Peterson, counted out his change with an air of profound disapproval. "People are talking, Roan," he said, his voice low. "It ain't right you keeping that woman out there. It ain't decent." Roan didn't flinch. He simply met the man's gaze with his own steady calm. "What I do on my land is my business, Peterson, and her name is Leanne. She is a guest in my home." He spoke the words plainly, without anger, but with a finality that cut off any further argument. Yet the hostility followed him home. It clung to the sacks of flour and salt, a poison seeping into their sanctuary. Leanne saw the change in him, the tightening of his jaw, the new watchfulness in his eyes. She saw the cost of her survival, a debt he was now paying to a town that had condemned her. The weight of it was unbearable. She was the source of his trouble, the stain on his reputation. He had saved her from the winter, only for her to become the cause of a different kind of storm, a social blizzard of whispers and glares. One evening, as he cleaned a piece of equipment by the fire, she finally gave voice to the fear that had been growing inside her. "You should have left me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped his work, his hands still. He looked at her, his expression serious. "No," he said, the single word carrying an immense weight. "I shouldn't have." "They hate you because of me." "They hated me long before you," he replied, a hint of dry, humorless irony in his voice. "I just never gave them a good reason. Now, it seems, I have." In that moment, he wasn't just her protector, he was her ally. He had drawn a line in the dirt, placing himself on her side of it, and the realization of it both terrified and thrilled her. The guilt, however, was a persistent weed, twisting around her heart. Every hostile glance Roan absorbed in town was a blow she felt herself. She had brought this trouble to his door, this man who asked for nothing but solitude. She began to see herself through the town's eyes, a burden, an impropriety, a foreign shadow cast over a good man's life. The only way to save him from her was to leave. The decision settled with the cold finality of a winter frost. One morning, while he was out checking the far pastures, she made her preparations. There was little to pack. The red Chong Sam, now carefully mended, a spare set of clothes he had given her, and the geography book she had been unable to bring herself to burn. She would walk east. She didn't know to where, only that it had to be away from here, away from him. She was tying her small bundle when he returned, earlier than she'd expected. He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, the bundle, her determined expression, the palpable air of departure. He said nothing for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. "Where are you going?" he finally asked, his voice quiet, devoid of accusation. "I cannot stay here," she said, her own voice trembling slightly. "I am causing you trouble. I will not be the reason this town turns on you." He walked into the room, closing the door behind him, shutting out the world. He stopped a few feet from her. "I told you, this is my business." "It is my life," she countered, a spark of her old fire returning. "You saved it. You do not get to carry the cost of it forever." He took another step closer. "And what if I want to?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and yet earth-shatteringly complex. It was not a declaration of love, not a promise of forever, but it was something more real, more grounded. It was a choice. "This is your home now, Leanne," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "If you want it to be." He wasn't commanding her to stay. He was inviting her. He was offering her a place not just to survive, but to belong. She looked from his earnest face to the small, sad bundle in her hands, and for the first time since winter, she felt the possibility of spring not just in the air, but inside her own heart. Their quiet declaration was soon put to the test. A week later, 3 men rode up to the ranch. Sheriff Miller was there, looking uncomfortable, but he was flanked by 2 others. Peterson, the storekeeper, and a stern, black-suited man named Henderson, the head of the town council. They dismounted without being invited, their presence an act of deliberate intrusion. Henderson was their spokesman. "Roan," he began, his tone oozing false civility, "we've come to discuss an unfortunate situation. The town has concerns about propriety, about the example being set." Leanne had been inside, but she came to stand in the doorway, refusing to hide. Henderson's eyes flickered towards her with disdain before returning to Roan. "It is not fitting for a woman, especially one of her background, to be living here unchaperoned. It reflects poorly on us all." Roan stood before them, his arms crossed over his chest, an unmovable mountain of a man. "What happens on my property is my concern, Henderson. I don't recall inviting the town council to oversee my affairs." "This is a moral affair," Henderson shot back, his voice rising. "For her own good and for the good of the community, she needs to be sent somewhere more appropriate. A mission in the city, perhaps." It was then that Leanne stepped forward, moving to stand beside Roan. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was clear and steady when she spoke. "You speak of my own good, Mr. Henderson. Did you consider my good when you and the rest of the town left me to freeze to death in an abandoned schoolhouse?" A shocked silence fell over the men. Peterson shuffled his feet, and even Sheriff Miller had the decency to look ashamed. Henderson, however, was unmoved. "Your circumstances were unfortunate, but that does not give you the right to flout our customs." "The custom of leaving a widow to starve?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "That is a custom I am happy to flout." "This man," she said, looking at Roan, "showed me a different custom, one of kindness and human dignity. I will not be leaving him." Her words, spoken with such quiet, unassailable strength, changed the dynamic completely. She was no longer a victim to be dealt with. She was a woman making a stand. Roan looked down at her, a flicker of something profound, pride, admiration, affection, in his eyes. He had offered her a home, and now, before the world, she had claimed it. The councilmen left in a cloud of dust and impotent fury, their threats hanging empty in the clean spring air. For now, the confrontation was over. Leanne and Roan stood together in the yard, watching them go, the silence between them no longer one of cautious distance, but of shared victory. The world outside remained hostile, its prejudices unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted within the borders of the ranch. It was no longer his sanctuary where she was a guest. It was their fortress. Later that evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft hues of purple and rose, they sat on the porch. The air was cool, but held the promise of warmth, fragrant with the scent of damp earth and new life. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The battle had been won, but the war for acceptance was far from over. Roan finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble. "You were good today." It was high praise from a man who used words like rare coins. She smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "I had a good teacher." He turned to look at her, his gaze intense in the fading light. He saw not the fragile woman he had pulled from the snow, but the resilient, intelligent person she had always been. He saw the strength that had kept her alive and the courage that had allowed her to speak her truth. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the wooden railing. His touch was warm, solid, a silent affirmation of everything that had passed between them. It was not a gesture of passion, but of deep, abiding partnership. "The town will not make it easy," he said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I know," she replied, her voice soft but firm. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. "We will not make it easy for them either." They looked out at the vast, darkening landscape, the rolling hills and the endless sky. It was a hard land, an unforgiving one, but it was no longer a place of exile. It was home. Their future was an unwritten page, a path they would have to carve for themselves, together. And as the first stars began to appear, they sat in comfortable silence, two solitary souls who had found in each other a constellation to navigate by. If you've been moved by their journey, let us know in the comments what you think the future holds for Leanne and Roanne. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and connection.